Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkshire, host, and our guest is Alan McHale, an assistant professor of history at Yale University. He is a historian of the early modern Muslim world, the Ottoman Empire, and Egypt, whose research and teaching focus mostly on the nature of early modern imperial rule, peasant histories, environmental resource management, and science and medicine. In one of the first environmental histories of the Ottoman Empire, Professor McHale examines relations between the empire and its most lucrative province of Egypt. Today we talk with him about his award-winning new book, Nature and Empire in Ottoman Egypt, an Environmental History. Welcome, Professor McHale.
Thanks very much.
This is your first book, and I think it's such a novel idea. What led you to write it?
At the most basic level, I was interested in the history of the Ottoman Empire in the Arab world. The Ottoman Empire ruled in most parts of the Arab world for about 350 years. So I was curious about the obvious impact that must have had on the region, and then also the region's impact on the Ottoman Empire as a whole and on imperial rule in different parts of the empire.
Okay, and where does the Ottoman Empire fall in terms of history, what years, and then what was going on in Egypt during that time?
Okay, so the conventional dates that are given for the empire are 1300 to 1922.
Okay.
So that's over 600 years, and the Ottoman Empire existed in what we today call the Middle East, in the Balkans, and in parts of North Africa.
Okay.
So it was a late medieval state, an early modern state, a 19th century modernizing state, and then a participant in World War I.
Okay.
So it has a huge history in multiple places, very different sorts of regions with different languages, different cultural traditions, different religions. So it touched on many different parts of what we now call the Old World. So Europe and the Balkans, obviously, Africa, Iran and Central Asia, Russia, the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, etc.
Okay. And give us an overview of your book. Tell a little bit about it.
Okay, so the book, as you mentioned in the introduction, is interested in, at the most general level, the relationship between Egypt and the rest of the Ottoman Empire.
Okay.
To get at that relationship, I wrote an environmental history because I came to see that that was the best way of getting at this relationship. So Egypt was conquered by Ottoman armies in 1517.
Okay.
Made one of the most important provinces of the empire. Over its history, it proved to be the most lucrative province in the Ottoman Empire. And then remained within the Ottoman fold. Historians disagree about this, but until the end of the 19th century. Some say the beginning of the 19th century, but I say the end of the 19th century. So my work is really focused on the 17th and the 18th centuries. And I examine in each chapter a different aspect of natural resource management. So this included water, obviously. In Egypt, the Nile is very important. So irrigation. This also included the production of food resources, so grains mostly. And then also I'm interested in the way that the empire managed the movement of wood to the province of Egypt, because Egypt was an excessive producer of grain, but didn't have a lot of native timber supplies, which were needed for various irrigation works, other building projects, other sort of infrastructural projects. So irrigation tied Egypt in a very intimate way to the rest of the empire. So we see a great interest on the part of the central administration of the capital in Istanbul, modern-day Turkey, in the sort of nitty-gritty, day-to-day, on-the-ground management of even the smallest canals in very rural parts of Egypt. So we have a very strong bureaucratic connection over the management of water. And the reason for that was because Egypt was such an important producer of grain for feeding different parts of the empire. So first I examine the management of water, and then I show how food was moved to different parts of the empire, how wood was brought from different parts of the empire to Egypt, so the opposite direction, mostly from Anatolia, southern Anatolia, so what is Turkey today,
Okay.
and then also from what today is Lebanon and parts of Syria. And then I'm also interested in the labor that undertook all of this and how that is managed. And then I end the book with an examination of how this system changed from the 18th century to the early 19th century, and how the management of natural resources moved from being controlled by local communities within Egypt, within an imperial framework, but nevertheless on the ground by local communities, to being managed more centrally from Cairo, and the implications of that, both for politics, for economic relations within the empire, and then also for environmental management.
Okay, and tell us about your methodology. It seems like it would be difficult to find all of these types of information. How did you go about that?
So before I began this project, I was also a little worried that these sorts of issues would not be adequately addressed by the archival materials that we have on this period, because many historians obviously have worked on this period. None have really dealt with environmental history or environmental resource management. Now, looking back on it, I see that my fears were a little misplaced, because obviously irrigation had such wide imperial importance, and so there are many records of it. So for my research, I used archival collections both in Istanbul, so the central repository of the Ottoman state is in Istanbul. And then I also use the records of local Islamic courts throughout Egypt. So I wanted to operate both at an imperial level and then also a local level and bring the two together. So that required using archival collections in Ottoman Turkish and in Arabic in Istanbul, and then also in Egypt.
When you looked at the records, the individual records, basically what is it showing you?
Okay, so for example, in the court records, you would have peasants from a certain community coming and saying, we're the farmers of village X. And the upstream village, village Y, has been taking more water from the canal than is their historic allotted amount. Therefore, less water is coming to us, so we're not able to irrigate our fields in the way that we need to produce the food that ultimately you, the Ottoman state, will tax. So you need to help us to deal with this situation.
Wow, very interesting that they have, such detailed records like that. Can you give us an example of how environmental history helps us understand the Ottoman Empire?
Okay, usually Ottoman historians are interested in a certain part of the Ottoman Empire, a province, and in doing that province's history. And yes, in relation to the Ottoman Empire, but really a history of that province. Or they're interested in doing a history of the capital and its institutions. So I was really attracted to doing an environmental history of the Ottoman Empire, because it allows us to do, I think, a sort of integrative history. So for example, I examine cases of the building of dams in Egypt, again, to help irrigate fields that would grow food that would be shipped to different parts of the empire, to North Africa, to parts of the Balkans, to parts of Anatolia, etc. But because Egypt doesn't have native wood supplies, that wood had to be brought from elsewhere. So I trace a particular case in the 1720s of the importation of wood from parts of southwestern Anatolia, so around what is today Izmir, and that wood being brought to Egypt, then being shipped down the Nile, and then taken to a certain village to build a small dam. So in tracing this history, it allows us to connect the history of the harvesting of wood and, for instance, the labor of the lumberjacks in southwestern Anatolia who harvested the wood, the merchant ships that brought that wood across the Mediterranean to Egypt, the sailors who sailed it down the Nile, ultimately to the people who used it in the countryside in Egypt to build this dam that, again, it will irrigate water to grow food that will be sent to different parts of the empire. So environmental history allows us to operate at these different scales of the village, right, the small-scale nitty-gritty community of the village, all the way up to the Mediterranean as a unit of analysis and different parts of the empire. And it allows us to bring in different actors. So in this case, the lumberjacks in Anatolia and the farmers in Egypt.
Very good. And conclusions. What are some of the conclusions you reach in your book?
So probably the main conclusion that I reach is that the local management of these natural resource processes was ultimately, from the perspective of those involved, more equitable, more sustainable, and ultimately better for their lives. And what do I mean by that? In the 19th century, when much of the management of irrigation was centralized by the imperial bureaucracy in Cairo, this led to the large-scale movement of peasants brought to work on canal projects, rather than in the previous centuries these canals being managed locally. It led to the salinization of soil on these projects. And ultimately, it led to less autonomy for these local communities. So I think there's a lesson that can be exported to places outside of the Ottoman Empire and outside of Egypt in terms of the local oversight over not just natural resources, but over, let's say, local resources more generally, and what happens when management of local resources becomes more centralized or more bureaucratized by some kind of central administration.
Yeah, that makes sense. Final question. I always like to know, in doing the research for the book, was there anything that particularly surprised you?
I think the thing that probably surprised me most was the level of detail that I was able to find in these different sources. Again, we find the enumeration of hundreds and hundreds of people, to the single individual. We find the weighing of, for instance, rice down to a very minute scale. And there's just copious amounts of sources about very small-scale, nitty-gritty kinds of things. And it's often said that the Ottoman Empire sailed on a sea of paper. And that's true. We're just beginning to scratch the surface of the sources that we have for Ottoman history. So I knew going in that I would find a lot, but the level of detail, I think, is what really surprised me.
So are you planning a step number 2 after this book, based on some of the things that you found?
I am. So in reading these cases of irrigation repair projects, for the most part, I came to see that animal labor was used in lots of these projects. So used to bring materials to the work site, used to haul away dirt, used sometimes even in the dredging of canals. And I found that curious at first. Now, again, it's not very surprising when I say it. And then I started sort of cluing into animals, and I noticed that they were all over the sources that I was reading. So for instance, in the Egyptian countryside, the ownership of animals represented the most significant form of capital for rural Egyptians, because technically the ownership of, technically they did not own the land that they used. But animals represented some of their most important forms of property. So in my next book, I want to trace the importance of animals to this rural economy. So I think we can't understand an early modern agrarian society without understanding the really important and multiple roles that animals played in the society. And then I think there are important changes that happen in the latter part of the 18th century. So I want to work on that and trace that in my next book project.
Okay, very good. Well, we'll look forward to that. Thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing some of your work. For more information about Professor McHale and his research, please visit our website at yale.edu/Macmillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.